In the darkest chapter of human history, certain names stand out as symbols of unimaginable cruelty. Today, we examine the life and crimes of Josef Kramer, a man whose actions during World War II earned him one of history's most chilling nicknames, the Beast of Belsen. Josef Kramer was not born a monster. He was an ordinary German man who made extraordinary choices that would lead to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. His story is not just about one individual's descent into barbarism, but about how ordinary people can become instruments of genocide when they embrace extremist ideology. This is a difficult story to tell, and an even more difficult one to hear. But it's a story that must be told. While we will handle this subject matter with appropriate sensitivity and respect, viewer discretion is advised. Josef Kramer was born on November 10, 1906, in Munich, Germany. He grew up in the turbulent period following World War I, when Germany was struggling with economic hardship, political instability, and national humiliation following the Treaty of Versailles. This was the environment that would give rise to the National Socialist movement. Little is known about Kramer's early childhood and family life. He received a basic education and worked various jobs in his youth, including as an apprentice bookkeeper. By all accounts, he was an unremarkable young man, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. This ordinariness is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his story, because it reminds us that the capacity for evil can exist in anyone. In 1931, at the age of 25, Kramer made a decision that would set the course for the rest of his life. He joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly known as the Nazi Party. Germany was in the midst of the Great Depression, and the Nazi Party was gaining support by promising to restore German pride and economic prosperity. For many young men like Kramer, the party offered a sense of purpose, belonging, and power. The following year, in 1932, Kramer took another fateful step. He joined the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS. Originally formed as a personal protection unit for Adolf Hitler, the SS would become one of the most powerful and feared organizations in Nazi Germany. It was the SS that would ultimately be responsible for implementing much of the Holocaust. Joining the SS was not a passive decision. Members had to prove their commitment to Nazi ideology, including belief in racial superiority and absolute loyalty to Hitler. They had to meet specific physical requirements and demonstrate their Aryan ancestry. By choosing to join this organization, Kramer was voluntarily associating himself with an ideology built on hatred and violence. Within the SS, Kramer received specialized training. He was trained as a prison guard and then specifically as a concentration camp guard. This training was designed to dehumanize prisoners and desensitize guards to suffering. Guards were taught to view prisoners as subhuman, as enemies of the state who deserved no compassion or mercy. In 1934, just 2 years after joining the SS, the young Josef Kramer received his first assignment. He was sent to Dachau, one of the first Nazi concentration camps established just outside Munich in 1933. At Dachau, Kramer would learn the brutal methods that would define the concentration camp system. Dachau was where Josef Kramer truly began his career as a concentration camp guard, and it was here that he caught the attention of senior SS officers. The camp system was expanding rapidly, and the Nazis needed men who were willing to carry out increasingly brutal policies without question or hesitation. Kramer proved to be exactly the kind of man they were looking for. What distinguished Kramer from other guards was his apparent enthusiasm for his work and his complete lack of empathy for prisoners. He carried out orders without hesitation, no matter how cruel, and he demonstrated initiative in finding new ways to maintain control through fear and violence. These qualities, which would be considered psychopathic in any normal society, were precisely what earned him recognition and promotion within the SS camp system. His superiors took notice of his dedication to Nazi ideology and his willingness to implement increasingly harsh measures against prisoners. In the twisted value system of the SS, brutality was a virtue, and Kramer excelled. He received a series of promotions, rising through the ranks faster than many of his contemporaries. Following his time at Dachau, Kramer was transferred to other camps in the expanding network. He served at Mauthausen, a camp in Austria that became notorious for its brutal conditions and forced labor in stone quarries. Guards at Mauthausen would force prisoners to carry heavy stones up steep stairs, and those who collapsed were often beaten or shot. The camp had one of the highest death rates in the entire system. He also spent time at Sachsenhausen, another major concentration camp located near Berlin. Sachsenhausen served as a training center for SS guards who would later staff other camps throughout occupied Europe. Here, Kramer continued to refine his methods of control and intimidation, learning from other experienced guards and sharing his own techniques. But the transfer that would prove most significant for Kramer's career came when he was assigned to Auschwitz. Auschwitz would become the largest and most infamous of all Nazi concentration and extermination camps. It was here that Kramer would work directly under Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, a man who oversaw the transformation of the camp into history's most efficient killing machine. Höss had been tasked with expanding Auschwitz beyond its original purpose as a concentration camp for political prisoners. Under his command, Auschwitz grew into a vast complex that combined forced labor camps, a concentration camp, and most horrifically, an extermination camp with gas chambers and crematoria designed specifically for mass murder. Over 1 million people, the vast majority of them Jewish, would be killed at Auschwitz. As Höss's assistant, Kramer was intimately involved in these expansion plans. He accompanied Höss on inspection tours and planning meetings. He helped coordinate the logistics of the camp's operations, including the construction of new facilities. One particular project involved establishing a new synthetic oil and rubber plant that would be staffed by prisoners from Auschwitz, essentially working them to death while extracting economic value from their labor. Working so closely with Höss gave Kramer a comprehensive understanding of how the Nazi extermination system functioned. He learned about the railway systems that brought prisoners to the camps, the selection processes that determined who would be worked to death and who would be killed immediately, and the methods used to efficiently murder thousands of people per day. He saw firsthand how bureaucracy, industrial efficiency, and ideological fanaticism could combine to create genocide on an unprecedented scale. But despite the power and responsibility he wielded as Höss's assistant, Kramer wanted more. He dreamed of having his own command, of being the absolute authority over a camp, rather than second in command to someone else. In April 1941, his ambition was rewarded. He received orders that would make him a commandant in his own right. In April 1941, Josef Kramer was appointed commandant of Natzweiler-Struthof, a concentration camp located in the Alsace region of France. This was a significant moment in Kramer's career. He was no longer answering to someone else or implementing another man's vision. Now he had the power to shape the camp according to his own methods, and the results would be devastating. Natzweiler-Struthof holds a unique and disturbing place in Holocaust history. It was the only concentration camp established by Nazi Germany on territory that is part of France today. The camp was situated in the Vosges Mountains, and its primary official purpose was to provide forced labor for a nearby granite quarry. Prisoners were forced to work in brutal conditions, extracting stone that would be used in Nazi construction projects. However, the quarry work was only one aspect of the camp's operations. Under Kramer's command, Natzweiler-Struthof became a site of medical experiments and other atrocities that extended far beyond forced labor. At his post-war trial, Kramer attempted to minimize his role in the camp's worst crimes. He claimed that when he arrived, there were no gas chambers at Natzweiler-Struthof. He portrayed himself as merely following orders when he oversaw the construction of a gas chamber on the instructions of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. But the existence of orders from superiors did not absolve Kramer of responsibility for what happened next. Having a gas chamber constructed was one thing. What he did with it was quite another. One of the most disturbing episodes during Kramer's tenure at Natzweiler-Struthof involved a specific request from Nazi racial scientists. In August 1943, Kramer personally carried out the gassing of 80 Jewish prisoners, 57 men and 29 women. But these people were not killed as part of the systematic extermination of European Jewry that was occurring at camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. They were killed for an even more grotesque purpose. These victims had been selected at Auschwitz specifically to be murdered at Natzweiler-Struthof. They were transported across occupied Europe to Kramer's camp, where he personally oversaw their deaths in the gas chamber he had constructed. The reason? Their bodies were to be preserved and sent to Professor August Hirt at the Reich University of Strasbourg, where they would become part of a so-called Jewish skeleton collection. This collection was intended to serve Nazi racial pseudoscience. The twisted logic was that these preserved bodies would allow future generations to study what the Nazis considered an inferior race, a race they were systematically trying to eliminate from Europe. It represented the intersection of Nazi ideology, pseudoscience, and bureaucratic murder at its most grotesque. During the gassing, one victim recognized what was about to happen and fought back. He was shot dead rather than gassed. The other 79 were murdered in the gas chamber, and their bodies were preserved and transported to the university in Strasbourg. Kramer's role in this atrocity was not that of a reluctant functionary simply following orders. Witness accounts describe him as efficient and methodical in carrying out these killings. He showed no hesitation or moral conflict about what he was doing. To him, these were simply tasks to be completed as part of his duties. Beyond this specific incident, the camp under Kramer's command was a place of constant suffering and death. Prisoners were subjected to brutal forced labor in the quarry, often in harsh mountain weather with inadequate clothing and nutrition. Medical experiments were conducted on prisoners, including tests of chemical weapons and attempts to find treatments for diseases like typhus, using concentration camp prisoners as unwilling test subjects. Prisoners were beaten regularly for minor infractions or for no reason at all. The death rate at Natzweiler-Struthof was high, with thousands dying from a combination of malnutrition, disease, executions, and the harsh conditions of forced labor. Bodies were disposed of in the camp's crematorium, the smoke from which could be seen by residents of nearby villages, though many chose to ignore what it represented. Kramer ruled the camp with absolute authority, and he used that authority to create an environment of terror. Prisoners lived in constant fear, never knowing if they would survive another day. Guards who served under Kramer reported that he actively encouraged brutal treatment of prisoners, and that he sometimes participated directly in beatings and other violence. After serving as commandant of Natzweiler-Struthof for over 3 years, Kramer was promoted to the rank of captain and transferred back to Auschwitz. But this time he would not be serving as an assistant. He was being given command of one of the most crucial elements of the Auschwitz complex. In 1944, Josef Kramer returned to Auschwitz, but now with significantly more authority and responsibility. He was appointed Lagerführer, or camp commander, of Auschwitz-II-Birkenau. This was perhaps the most horrific posting in the entire Nazi camp system, because Birkenau was the primary site of mass extermination within the Auschwitz complex. To understand the significance of this appointment, it's important to understand the structure of Auschwitz. What we commonly call Auschwitz was actually a complex of 3 main camps and dozens of subcamps. Auschwitz I was the original camp, serving as the administrative center and as a concentration camp for political prisoners and others deemed enemies of the Nazi state. Auschwitz-Monowitz was primarily a forced labor camp serving a chemical plant. But Auschwitz-II-Birkenau was something different. Birkenau was purpose-built as an extermination camp. It contained 4 large gas chambers and crematoria capable of murdering and disposing of thousands of people per day. It was to Birkenau that trains arrived carrying Jews from across occupied Europe, part of what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question. The process at Birkenau followed a horrific routine. Trains would arrive at the camp's railway platform, often after days of travel, in sealed, overcrowded cattle cars without food, water, or sanitation. The passengers would be ordered off the trains, often confused and exhausted, with no idea of what awaited them. On the platform, SS doctors would conduct what was called a selection. They would quickly assess each person, usually with nothing more than a glance and a gesture. Those deemed fit for work, typically young, healthy-looking men and women, would be sent to one side. Everyone else, including children, the elderly, the sick, and mothers with young children, would be sent to the other side. Those selected for work would be tattooed with a prisoner number and sent to the camp. Those selected for immediate death would be told they were going to shower facilities to be deloused. In reality, they were being sent directly to the gas chambers. The entire process from arrival to cremation could take just a few hours. The Nazis had industrialized murder. This was the system that Josef Kramer was appointed to oversee in his role as commander of Birkenau. During his tenure, hundreds of thousands of people were murdered in the gas chambers under his watch. The summer and fall of 1944 were particularly horrific periods, as approximately 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in a matter of months, the vast majority going directly to the gas chambers. At his trial after the war, Kramer attempted to distance himself from these atrocities. He claimed that he had received written orders from Hus, stating that he had nothing to do with either the gas chambers or the incoming transports. He testified that the political department of Auschwitz I was responsible for selections, and that the crematoria were under the direct command of the overall Auschwitz commandant, not him. He admitted that he was sometimes present when transports arrived, but claimed this was only because they arrived in the middle of his camp. He stated that the actual selections were conducted only by doctors and that security personnel came from both Auschwitz-Birkenau and his own camp at Birkenau, but that he had no direct authority over them. According to Kramer's testimony, those selected for work would remain at Birkenau temporarily before being transferred to other camps throughout Germany. He portrayed himself as essentially a bystander to the extermination process, a camp administrator whose camp happened to be located near the killing facilities, but who had no direct involvement in the murders. This portrayal was demonstrably false. Numerous survivors testified that Kramer took an active and often enthusiastic role in the selection process. They described seeing him on the platform pointing left or right with his hand or his riding crop, personally determining who would live and who would die. Some witnesses reported that he seemed to enjoy this power over life and death. Beyond the selections, witnesses described Kramer's direct involvement in forcing prisoners toward the gas chambers. In one particularly disturbing account, he was seen loading people onto trucks himself, physically forcing them onto vehicles when they resisted or showed fear. When people refused to comply or tried to run, he would beat them violently, sometimes to the point of death, right there on the platform. Kramer gained a reputation among prisoners and SS personnel alike as exceptionally brutal, even by the standards of Auschwitz. He was known for sudden violent outbursts, for beating prisoners without provocation, and for showing complete indifference to human suffering. Prisoners learned to avoid him whenever possible, because encountering Kramer often meant a beating or worse. His time at Birkenau firmly established his reputation as one of the most brutal and effective killers in the SS camp system. But in December 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and the Nazi regime began its collapse, Kramer received new orders. He was being transferred to another camp, one that would give him his most infamous nickname. In December 1944, Josef Kramer was transferred from Auschwitz-Birkenau to Bergen-Belsen, a camp located near the small German village of Belsen in Lower Saxony. It was here, in the final months of the war, that Kramer would oversee some of the worst conditions in the entire Nazi camp system, earning him the nickname that would define his legacy, the Beast of Belsen. Bergen-Belsen had not originally been established as an extermination camp. It began in 1943 as a holding camp for Jews who the Nazis thought might be exchanged for German prisoners of war or for financial considerations. Some prisoners were actually released and allowed to emigrate, though this was rare. The camp was divided into several sections, including a special section for prominent Jews who might be valuable as hostages. However, as the war turned decisively against Germany and Soviet and Allied forces advanced from both east and west, Bergen-Belsen's nature changed dramatically. The Nazis began evacuating concentration camps in occupied Poland and elsewhere, desperate to hide evidence of their crimes and to prevent prisoners from being liberated. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced on death marches toward camps inside Germany, and many of those who survived these marches ended up at Bergen-Belsen. When Kramer arrived at Bergen-Belsen to take command, the camp was already severely overcrowded. He later claimed that he found 15,000 prisoners at the camp when he took over, already far more than the facilities were designed to hold. But the situation was about to become catastrophically worse. In the first months of 1945, as more and more camps were evacuated, Bergen-Belsen became one of the primary destinations for prisoners from across the Nazi camp system. Trains and columns of marching prisoners arrived constantly, and the camp's population exploded. By April 1945, there were approximately 60,000 prisoners crowded into a space designed for a fraction of that number. The infrastructure of the camp completely collapsed under this influx. There was nowhere near enough food to feed this many people. The water supply was inadequate. Sanitation systems broke down entirely. Disease, particularly typhus and typhoid fever, spread rapidly through the overcrowded barracks. Prisoners were dying not by the dozens or hundreds, but by the thousands. Kramer, as commandant, was responsible for managing this catastrophe. At his trial, he attempted to deflect responsibility, claiming that he had tried to address the problems, but was thwarted by circumstances beyond his control. He said that he had requested more food supplies from his superiors, but that the camp was given low priority, with supplies going first to nearby towns and cities, then to the military, and only finally to the camps. He blamed the deteriorating transportation system and the winter weather for the difficulty in getting adequate supplies to the camp. He claimed that there were not enough toilets in the compounds and that he had ordered ditches to be dug as makeshift latrines in an attempt to address the sanitation crisis. He acknowledged that disease was rampant and that the lack of delousing facilities made it impossible to control the spread of typhus. Records do show that Kramer sent reports to his superiors describing the terrible conditions and requesting assistance. However, these explanations do not absolve Kramer of responsibility for what happened at Bergen-Belsen. Yes, the camp was overwhelmed by the influx of prisoners from evacuated camps. Yes, the collapse of Germany's infrastructure made it difficult to supply the camp adequately. But Kramer's response to this crisis was to maintain the same brutal, indifferent attitude toward prisoner welfare that had characterized his entire career. Rather than trying to organize the distribution of what limited resources were available, rather than attempting to improve sanitation or separate the sick from the healthy to slow disease transmission, Kramer continued to treat the prisoners with contempt and violence. Beatings and executions continued even as thousands were dying of starvation and disease. Prisoners reported seeing Kramer kicking and beating people regularly, sometimes to death, even as corpses piled up around the camp. Food that did arrive was often distributed unfairly, with some prisoner groups receiving more than others based on various criteria that had nothing to do with need. There was no organized medical care, despite the presence of prisoner doctors who could have provided at least basic treatment if given supplies and support. Bodies were left lying in the open because there was no longer any organized system for removing them. Rats infested the camp, feeding on corpses. By March 1945, the death rate at Bergen-Belsen had reached approximately 18,000 people per month. Think about that number. 18,000 human beings died in a single month, not in gas chambers, but from deliberate neglect, starvation, disease, and brutality. The camp had become a death trap, and Kramer was the man in charge. As Allied forces closed in on Germany from all directions, many SS guards began to flee Bergen-Belsen, terrified of what would happen to them when the Allies discovered what they had done. The camp descended further into chaos as administration broke down almost completely. But Josef Kramer remained at his post, still the commandant of Bergen-Belsen. On April 15, 1945, British forces arrived at Bergen-Belsen. What they found was beyond anything they had imagined. Despite having been warned that conditions in Nazi camps were terrible, the British soldiers encountered scenes of indescribable horror. There were approximately 60,000 prisoners still alive in the camp, most of them severely emaciated and sick. Many were too weak to move. Approximately 13,000 corpses lay scattered around the camp, some in piles, others lying where they had fallen. The stench was overwhelming. Disease was so widespread that the British immediately faced the challenge of preventing the typhus epidemic from spreading to their own forces and to the surrounding area. Many prisoners who had survived until liberation would die in the days and weeks afterward, too far gone to be saved even with proper medical care. In the first weeks after liberation, thousands more would die. What struck the British liberators as perhaps most disturbing was Josef Kramer's behavior. Rather than showing shame or attempting to escape, Kramer actually gave the British troops a tour of the camp. He walked with them through the compounds, showing them the piles of corpses, the overcrowded barracks, the emaciated prisoners. He pointed out the mass graves and explained the camp's layout as if he were a tour guide showing off a historical site. Some witnesses reported that Kramer seemed almost proud of what he had done, or at the very least, utterly indifferent to the suffering he had caused. He showed no remorse, no recognition that what had happened at Bergen-Belsen was a crime of monstrous proportions. To him, he had simply been doing his job, following orders, managing a difficult situation as best he could. The British took Kramer into custody as a prisoner of war, along with many other SS personnel who had remained at the camp. But they would not remain prisoners of war for long. Justice was coming. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen sent shockwaves around the world. Journalists and photographers accompanied the British forces, and their reports and images provided many people with their first visual evidence of the atrocities committed in Nazi concentration camps. The British government was determined that those responsible would be held accountable. The Belsen trial began on September 17, 1945, in Lüneburg, Germany. It was one of the first major war crimes trials conducted after World War II, preceding even the more famous Nuremberg trials. 45 defendants were charged with crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Josef Kramer was the primary defendant. The trial lasted nearly 2 months. The prosecution called numerous witnesses, including survivors who testified about the conditions they had endured and the atrocities they had witnessed. They described Kramer's brutality, his participation in selections at Auschwitz, his violence toward prisoners, and his callous indifference to the mass death at Bergen-Belsen. Medical experts testified about the conditions found at Bergen-Belsen at liberation and the causes of death for so many prisoners. British soldiers who had liberated the camp described what they had found and their interactions with Kramer and other SS personnel. Documentary evidence was presented, including reports that Kramer himself had written about conditions at the camp. Throughout the trial, Kramer maintained that he had simply been following orders and doing his duty. He denied personal responsibility for the atrocities, claiming that he had been a subordinate officer carrying out instructions from his superiors. He attempted to portray himself as a professional soldier who had been placed in impossible situations and had done what he could within the constraints of his position. The judges were not persuaded. The evidence against Kramer was overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses testified to his direct participation in selections and murders at Auschwitz. His own records documented the conditions at Bergen-Belsen under his command. There was no doubt that he had been in positions of authority at both camps, and that he had not only implemented murderous policies, but had often exceeded what was required of him, showing personal initiative in cruelty. On November 17, 1945, Josef Kramer was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. He was 41 years old. Kramer was executed on December 13, 1945, at Hameln Prison in Germany. He went to the gallows alongside several other convicted war criminals from the Belsen trial. According to witnesses to the execution, Kramer showed no remorse in his final moments, maintaining until the end that he had simply been doing his duty as a soldier. The story of Josef Kramer is deeply disturbing, not just because of the atrocities he committed, but because of what it reveals about human nature and the dangers of ideological extremism. Kramer was not born evil. He was not insane in any clinical sense. He was an ordinary man who made choices that led him to become one of history's most brutal war criminals. Kramer's life demonstrates how people can become desensitized to suffering when they are trained to dehumanize others. The Nazi ideology taught that certain groups of people were less than human, that they were dangerous enemies or inferior beings who had no right to exist. Once someone accepts these premises, once they stop seeing victims as fellow human beings, almost any atrocity becomes possible. His rise through the camp system shows how organizations can create incentive structures that reward the worst human behaviors. In the SS camp system, brutality was not just accepted, but encouraged. Those who showed hesitation or compassion were seen as weak. Those who were most efficient at implementing murderous policies, most willing to inflict suffering, were the ones who received promotions and positions of greater authority. Kramer's career also illustrates the danger of the just following orders defense. Yes, he received orders from superiors. Yes, he operated within a system designed to facilitate genocide. But he had choices at every step. He chose to join the Nazi Party and the SS. He chose to become a concentration camp guard. He chose to seek promotions that gave him greater authority over prisoners. And at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, witnesses testified that he went beyond what was required, that he showed personal initiative in cruelty. The conditions at Bergen-Belsen in particular demonstrate the consequences of bureaucratic indifference to human suffering. Even accepting that the camp was overwhelmed by evacuated prisoners, even acknowledging that Germany's infrastructure was collapsing, there were still choices that could have been made to reduce suffering. Food could have been distributed more fairly. Sanitation could have been improved with the resources available. Beatings and executions could have stopped. These choices were not made. The legacy of Josef Kramer and others like him is not just the immense suffering they caused, but the reminder they provide of what can happen when hatred is allowed to flourish, when ordinary people choose to participate in systems of oppression and genocide, and when the world fails to stand against such evil. The Holocaust was not carried out by a handful of evil masterminds. It required the participation of hundreds of thousands of people, most of them ordinary individuals who made the choice to participate, to benefit from, or simply to look away from genocide. Josef Kramer was one of those people, distinguished only by his apparent enthusiasm for cruelty and his rise to positions where he could cause immense harm. We study these dark chapters of history not to dwell on human evil, but to understand how such atrocities happen and to commit ourselves to preventing them in the future. The story of Josef Kramer reminds us why we must remain vigilant against hatred and dehumanization in all its forms, why we must stand up against injustice even when it's difficult, and why we must never forget what happened when these principles were abandoned. Thank you for watching this difficult but important examination of history. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to support our channel. Remember, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. Until next time.